Have you ever stopped to think that everything we're living today was already part of a much greater plan from the very beginning? God's plan from creation to the flood is not just a sequence of ancient events. It's a living story that shapes the way we understand the world, faith, and the purpose of our existence. Today, we're going to dive into the beginning of it all. From the creation of the world through Adam and Eve to the judgment and mercy that met inside Noah's Ark. A journey that reveals not only divine judgment, but also grace, redemption, and a covenant that echoes to this very day. So, if you've ever wondered what God's true plan for humanity was and where you fit into that story, stay with me until the end. The answer might change the way you see your life. In the beginning, when nothing existed but God, He chose to create, and He created with purpose, beauty, and order. God's plan was revealed from the very first verses of the Bible. When the heavens and the earth were formed, when light was separated from darkness, and every detail of the universe came to life, none of it was by chance. Every element of creation pointed to something greater: communion, meaning, and love. The human being was the pinnacle of that creation. Made in the image and likeness of God, man was given not just form but essence. Unlike any other creature, Adam was created to reflect the Creator, to live in relationship with Him and to care for the earth. The creation of the world is not just an old story in Genesis. It reveals the value we've had before the Father since the dawn of humanity. Everything was good. There was no pain, no guilt, no fear, no separation. God's purpose was clear: a deep, perfect relationship with mankind. And that same purpose still echoes today, calling us back to the beginning before the fall, when God's plan was only love, presence, and peace. The Garden of Eden was more than a physical paradise. It was a place of living communion between God and man. Adam and Eve lived surrounded by beauty, abundance, and peace. But the greatest gift wasn't in the trees or rivers. It was in freedom. God created them with the gift of free will, the ability to choose to love Him, to obey or not. And with that freedom came responsibility. God set a clear boundary not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't a cruel imposition, but an opportunity to show trust and obedience. They had everything, but that single boundary revealed God's respect for human choice. God's purpose was never control, but to walk together in love and truth. This part of the biblical story teaches us so much about life. Even today, we are free. And with that freedom comes the responsibility to live according to His guidance. Genesis shows us that from the very beginning, living under divine direction was part of the plan. Freedom in the Garden of Eden reminds us that true love only exists when there is choice. The serpent, a symbol of cunning and rebellion, approaches Eve with a question that casts doubt on God's goodness. With subtlety, it twists the Creator's words, awakening in Eve a desire to be like God. Adam, instead of leading with strength, also gives in to temptation. There in the heart of Eden, original sin is born, and with it a separation that would change everything. The perfect communion with the Creator is broken. Man and woman realize their nakedness, feel shame, and hide from God. What once was a relationship built on trust is now marked by fear and guilt. The consequences are deep. Pain, hard labor, expulsion from the garden, and above all, spiritual death. The beginning of humanity is marked by a choice that still echoes today. But even in the midst of judgment, we see divine mercy. God seeks out man, asks where he is, covers his nakedness, and promises redemption. The fall of man didn't catch God by surprise. On the contrary, his plan already included a way back. This part of the Old Testament is not just about failure, but about a father who never gives up on his children. Even in the very moment of mankind's fall, when all seemed lost, God does something astonishing. He doesn't just confront Adam and Eve, he declares a promise. In Genesis 3 verse 15, we find the first glimpse of the gospel. From the seed of the woman will come one who will crush the serpent's head. This phrase hidden within the judgment reveals God's plan to redeem humanity from the very beginning. It's as if he was saying, I have already prepared a way out. This verse is known by many scholars as the Proto-Evangelium, the first announcement of the good news. There, in the midst of the pain of original sin, God plants the hope of salvation. The biblical story begins to point towards someone greater, a descendant who will overcome evil. God's plan wasn't interrupted by the fall. It only began to reveal its depth. Genesis shows us that redemption is not a last-minute solution, but an eternal purpose. This promise travels through generations through patriarchs, kings, and prophets, and is fulfilled in the Messiah. Since Adam and Eve, the biblical genealogy has carried this invisible thread of hope, weaving faith and obedience into the hearts of those who trust. God's judgment and his divine mercy walk side by side. The seed of the woman is more than a promise. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, God never leaves us without a way out. As generations passed after Adam and Eve, humanity began to drift further and further from God's plan. The world, which had been created with care and purpose, sank into violence, selfishness, and injustice. The biblical narrative shows us that men began to follow their own ways, ignoring the voice of the Creator. What was meant to be a journey of communion became a portrait of corruption and decay. But even in the face of such evil, God did not act in haste that he watched. He waited. He gave time. God's long-suffering, his divine patience is a sign of his love and desire for reconciliation. He didn't want to destroy mankind, but to give an opportunity for repentance. And in the midst of the darkness, there were still those who chose to live by faith. Men like Enoch and Noah proved that faith and obedience were still possible even in the hardest times. This part of the Bible teaches us something powerful. God's judgment does not come without many warnings and opportunities. Divine mercy is real. The heart of the Creator grieves when he sees his creation wandering from its purpose. The Old Testament doesn't reveal an impatient God. It reveals a Father who waits. And even today, he continues to call each person back to his plan with patience, with love, and with justice. As the earth filled with violence and hearts turned away from God's design, there was one man walking in the opposite direction. His name was Noah. In the midst of a corrupt generation, he was found righteous. That doesn't mean he was perfect, but he chose to live in obedience. The Old Testament shows us that God was pleased with him, and that made all the difference in the biblical story. Noah didn't just hear God's voice. He trusted and he acted. When he received the instruction to build the ark, he didn't question. He didn't ask for proof. He started building even without a cloud in the sky. That is faith and obedience in their purest form. In the face of mockery and indifference from those around him, Noah stood firm. The ark was far more than a boat. It was a symbol of trust in God. This part of Scripture inspires us to do the same. In a time when many walk away from the truth, we are called to live like Noah, to obey even without seeing, to believe even without understanding. God's plan does not change with the circumstances around us. And even today, He is looking for hearts willing to say yes. Even when it sounds like madness, even when it's hard. Faith is continuing to build when no one else believes. Then came the time for God's judgment. Wickedness had spread so far that the earth no longer reflected His purpose. But the flood was not an outburst of rage. It was an act of justice. The Creator who had watched the worlds beginning with love and purpose now had to purify what had been corrupted. The water that poured from the heavens washed the earth, but it also revealed the faithfulness of those who trusted in God. Noah's ark became the refuge for those who chose faith. As the waters rose, Noah's obedience became the salvation. The Bible shows us that the same God who judges also saves. He didn't abandon humanity. He preserved hope. And the biblical story teaches us that even in the midst of judgment, there is always room for divine mercy. This moment marks a turning point literally and spiritually. The flood was God's divine response to a directionless earth. But it was also a new breath for the future. It reminds us that even when everything seems lost, God is still in control. His purpose was not interrupted. It was simply preparing the ground for a fresh start. And in every drop of that rain, there was also a promise that He would never leave us without a way out. When the waters receded and the earth became dry again, a new chapter in the biblical story began. God had preserved life and with it renewed His plan for humanity. When Noah left the ark, he didn't rush to rebuild his house. The first thing he did was build an altar. He thanked God, acknowledging that all of this was only possible because of divine mercy. Then God did something extraordinary. He established a covenant with Noah, an everlasting pact sealed with a visible symbol, the rainbow. This covenant with God brings a clear promise. Never again would the earth be destroyed by water. It wasn't just a beautiful sign in the sky. It was the expression of the faithfulness of a God who continues to love His creation even after the fall, the mistake and original sin. This new beginning is more than a physical restart. It represents the continuation of God's purpose even after His judgment. The creation of the world had been marred. But now God was showing that His grace would always be greater than human error. Noah's story recorded in the Old Testament reminds us that when there is faith and obedience, there is also restoration. God still desires to walk with us. There is always a new rainbow after the storm. And what does all of this mean for us today? The same God who created, judged, and saved in Genesis is still acting in the world. God's plan did not end with the covenant with Noah or the flood. It continues. The Bible reveals that despite humanity's challenges, God is calling each of us to be part of His story. The message is clear. He still desires a relationship. And his invitation is for everyone in any age. Through Christ, God's plan was fulfilled definitively. The same love we saw in the creation of the world and patience with sin and in salvation through Noah's ark manifested itself on the cross. Jesus came to restore the communion lost in the Garden of Eden, to bring redemption to all who follow him with faith and obedience. The promised Messiah from Genesis 3 verse 15 has come, and with him the chance for a new beginning. So what is your role in this story? God's plan continues, and the question remains, how are you responding to God's call for your life? What we can learn from the biblical story of Noah and God's covenant is that even in times of chaos, there is divine direction for those who choose to obey. God's plan is not just in the past. It is real now and extends to each one of us. As we reflect on God's plan revealed in the Bible, from the creation of the world to the flood, we are reminded that he has a divine purpose for each of us. The story of Noah and God's covenant is not just an ancient account, but a living invitation to live in communion with the Creator, obey his call, and trust in his divine mercy, even in difficult times. If you feel touched by this message of redemption and hope, know that God's plan for your life is also in motion. No matter where you are on your journey, God always offers an opportunity for a fresh start, just as he did for Noah and his family. Don't let this chance pass by. Jesus is the answer that restores everything that was lost, bringing a new beginning to those who receive him with faith and obedience. Now, I want to hear from you. How have you perceived God's plan in your own life? Leave your reflections, share your experiences, or ask any questions in the comments. And if this video spoke to your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this message with others. Remember, God's purpose does not end here.